Ibrahim Traoré came to the U.S. without a script, took the stage uninvited, and delivered the kind of truth that made grown men cry and the internet explode overnight. Nobody saw his name on the flyer, not in the emails, not even in the whispers passed around in the hotel lobby 2 nights before the summit. That Sunday morning, the Pan-African Unity Summit was already buzzing. Hundreds had gathered at the Civic Hall in downtown Oakland, California. The air smelled like coffee and fried plantains from the vendors outside, and conversations floated through the room in a blend of English, Yoruba, Creole, and Twi. Organizers were running back and forth, adjusting name cards and AV cables. No one knew that the man who would shift the atmosphere completely was already walking up the back stairs, quiet, eyes forward. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't supposed to be there. The youngest leader in Africa, the face of Burkina Faso's resistance against neocolonial influence, had landed in the U.S. just 2 days earlier under minimal press coverage. Some guessed it was for diplomatic meetings. Others thought he was here to see his cousin in Minneapolis. Nobody guessed he'd show up unannounced in California. The summit had rolled through its first hour as expected. A former mayor from New Jersey spoke about economic development. A professor from Howard gave a moving, if rehearsed, lecture about diaspora bridges. Then the host, a woman in a bright turquoise head wrap and silver flats, walked onto the stage holding her earpiece. She leaned into the mic and smiled, but it was a nervous smile. We have a special guest," she said. "Someone I think many of you have wanted to hear from. Please, stay seated and give a warm welcome to Captain Ibrahim Traoré." There was a pause, long enough for someone to say "who" under their breath. A few clapped out of courtesy. Others looked at each other, confused, and then he walked out. He wasn't in military uniform, just a sand-colored shirt, sleeves rolled, dark jeans, and a pair of dusty brown boots. He carried no notes, no papers, no entourage, just him. The spotlight followed as he walked slowly to the center of the stage. The auditorium stilled. From the second he opened his mouth, his voice didn't ask for attention, it claimed it. "Brothers, sisters, I did not come here with answers. I came here because I carry the same questions as you." He spoke slowly, letting silence do half the work. His French was thick, but his English was deliberate. His accent carried no apology, no performance. He sounded like a man who didn't need validation, and that made people sit up straighter. Some in the back started recording on their phones. A few leaned forward. An elder in the second row looked over her glasses and whispered to her daughter, "This one sounds different." He talked about power, not the kind in parliaments or palaces, but the kind rooted in soil, in memory, in names that were taken and names we had to reclaim. He didn't reference himself once, didn't speak of coups or titles or negotiations, just the soul of a people that had been traded, broken, scattered, and still kept rising. But even as his voice filled the space, you could feel a quiet tension. People weren't sure if they should trust it. Was it too poetic? Too clean? One man near the side aisle kept shaking his head, arms folded. 2 college students behind him were Googling Traoré as he spoke. Yet, line by line, something shifted. A girl in cornrows lowered her phone and just watched. An uncle in a denim vest closed his eyes. One woman in a mustard sweater looked like she was holding her breath. He wasn't saying anything brand new, but it didn't sound like what they were used to. And maybe that's what made it powerful. He was reminding them of things they hadn't heard in a while, without dressing them up, without giving it the flavor of shame or guilt or soft applause. And he still hadn't raised his voice once, but something in the room had changed, and no one was ready to admit it just yet. He gripped the edge of the podium with both hands, not tightly, not like someone who needed to hold himself steady, but like someone anchoring himself to the moment. His eyes swept across the audience. He didn't smile, he didn't gesture, he let the quiet do the work. "You have power in your blood," he said, "but someone taught you to be ashamed of it." The words hit hard. He wasn't warming them up. There was no polite preamble, just a blunt truth thrown into the air like a brick through glass. A few heads turned, others sat still, unsure whether to nod or wince. Traoré glanced toward the third row where a group of organizers were seated. One of them, a tall man in a gray sports coat, tapped on his phone nervously, eyes darting from the screen to the stage. A woman next to him leaned in and whispered, "We didn't approve this, right?" He didn't answer. Back on stage, Traoré had launched into rhythm. Here in the U.S., you've been told that your strength is dangerous, your pride is aggression, that your history is trauma, that your anger is a threat. But let me tell you, where I come from, they say the same things. He paused, then, in a softer tone, continued. They say we are poor, backward, hopeless, that we should be grateful for handouts, for soldiers who don't speak our languages, for schools that teach our children to forget their ancestors. His voice was low, but the silence in the room gave him a megaphone. But we are not poor, not in soul, not in spirit, not in story, and neither are you. Something shifted. A woman in the back murmured, "That's right." A few people clapped. Not a standing ovation, but a signal. They were listening now, really listening. Traoré didn't let up. I've walked through villages with no running water, and I've seen boys studying under kerosene lamps, learning history that denies their existence. I've walked through cities in Africa where foreign flags fly over government buildings, and now I walk here, in your cities, and what do I see? He looked around, letting the question sink. I see neighborhoods where wealth was stripped and families separated. I see schools with metal detectors and liquor stores on every corner. I see a people trained to forget that they are global, that they are not just from Georgia or Louisiana or Michigan, but from Ashanti, from Mossi, from Igbo, from Wolof. There was a low murmur from the right side of the room. An older man, sharp in his all-black suit, leaned forward in his seat, lips pressed together. He didn't clap, he just stared. It was the kind of stare that meant he hadn't expected this. But now that it was happening, he couldn't look away. Traoré shifted from English to French and back again, seamlessly, offering no apology. In French, he spoke of land theft and IMF policies. In English, he made it plain. They don't want Africa to stand up, because if Africa stands, the descendants of Africa here will stand too, and that balance, that frightens many. He paused again, letting his hands drop from the podium. But your power frightens only those who depend on your silence. Now people were sitting taller. The tension was changing. Less like suspicion, more like curiosity with a tinge of hope. You could feel that crackle in the air, not dramatic but real. Something was building. From the left side of the room, a young man in a maroon hoodie leaned over to his friend and whispered, "He's saying what my granddad used to say." His friend replied, "Yeah, but he's saying it like he means it." And that was it. It wasn't the words themselves that were shaking the room. It was the weight behind them. The way Traoré spoke like someone who didn't want applause, didn't care for a headline. He wasn't trying to sell a dream. He was handing out reminders, sharp, unfiltered reminders that didn't come wrapped in slogans. No slides, no slogans, just truth. But he was only getting started, and soon he'd say something that would quiet even the skeptics in the back. By the time Ibrahim Traoré took a sip of water, the room had shifted from stiff to locked in, the kind of focus that makes people forget to check their phones. Nobody was coughing, nobody was whispering. He put the glass down, then looked straight into the crowd again. In Burkina Faso, when a child asks, "It's why there's no bread," the answer is not hunger. It's history, Cipton, he said. We had gold, cotton, uranium, still do, but someone else always owns the contract. A few people nodded, slowly. He continued, "That is what we are taught in silence. That even if the land is ours, the future is not. But let me tell you," he leaned in slightly, "your history, here in America, is not so different. It has just been better packaged." He let that one sit. Traoré's gaze moved from face to face, as if he was checking to see who was still with him. "Tell me, why do your schools not teach you about Patrice Lumumba, about Thomas Sankara, about Amilcar Cabral?" He didn't wait for an answer. "They don't want you to connect the dots. They want you to believe you were born from slavery, not from kingdoms, from violence, not from genius." He raised a finger, not to lecture, but like he was pointing something out in plain daylight. "But you are the children of survivors. That blood didn't vanish. It crossed the sea. It learned a new language. It raised families in Detroit and Tulsa and Little Rock, and then it was told to forget itself." At the mention of Tulsa, an older woman near the front closed her eyes for a moment. Not out of fatigue, but because it hit something in her. She had grown up hearing about the massacre in whispers. Now, here was a man from the continent saying the names her teachers had skipped. Traoré lowered his voice. "In my country, we fought off the French. Not once, many times. We paid in lives, and today we still pay. But we are not the only ones. Your families, your grandmothers, your fathers, they fought too, just not always with guns. Sometimes with books, with prayers, with kitchen table meetings no one wrote about." He stepped back from the mic for a moment, then returned. "There is a thread between us. It is not pity. It is not charity. It is not performance. It is history. One chain split in half thrown across two continents." Now the claps came naturally, not loud, but steady. People were thinking, hard. A teenager in a varsity jacket was recording and whispering, "Bro, he's saying everything." A man in the balcony nodded slowly while wiping the corner of his eye. But not everyone was impressed. Near the exit doors, a woman in a navy pantsuit leaned over to another guest and said under her breath, "I just wish he'd be more practical." Traoré seemed to hear it somehow, or maybe he just felt the temperature shift. He smiled, just briefly, and said, "You want solutions? Start with truth. You cannot fix a house by pretending the foundation is not cracked." There was laughter now, a knowing, tired laughter that comes not from joy, but from recognition. Then he paused again, letting the room exhale. "I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to remind you what's already inside you." He glanced down, then looked back up. "Don't ask the same people who locked your doors to hand you the keys." That one hit. You could hear it, feel it. A woman in the fourth row whispered to herself, "Say that again." And someone nearby did, quietly. "Don't ask them for keys." Traoré let the echo settle, then he stepped away from the podium altogether and walked toward the edge of the stage, hands still at his sides. "No one gave us our dignity back in Burkina Faso. We had to take it, and so must you." He stood still. "And when we meet in the middle, not as victims or as enemies, but as family, everything changes." But before the applause could rise, he said one more sentence, and that was when the room stopped breathing. "You have not failed," Traoré said, still at the edge of the stage. "You were made to believe that survival is shameful. It is not. Survival is sacred." And just like that, the air shifted again. Not with applause this time, but reflection. The kind of silence that makes people look down, then back up, like they're reassembling something they hadn't touched in years. In the middle row sat Marcia Darnell, a retired school teacher from Baton Rouge, 71 years old, silver locks pulled back into a bun, thick glasses she'd cleaned 3 times already since the speech began. She didn't expect to feel much that morning. She'd been to dozens of these kinds of events. She came because her granddaughter asked her to. But now she couldn't stop thinking about her father, about the way he used to play records in their living room while telling her stories about segregation at McKinley High. She thought about how he never used the word power, but how everything he did, walking to work in a white man's shoes, putting $1 in a black-owned bank every week, was power. Marcia reached into her purse for a tissue. A few rows behind her, on the right side, Isaiah Benson shifted in his seat. 26, born in Stockton, California, raised by a single mom. He had no idea who Ibrahim Traoré was before today. Came with his cousin because he wanted to network, maybe shake hands with a few speakers, shoot a promo video. But now he was gripping his phone, recording everything. Not for TikTok, not for his brand, just because he knew, somewhere deep down, that his future kids needed to hear this one day. Isaiah thought about the job he just lost, about how his manager had praised him one week, then let him go the next, citing budget cuts. He thought about the way he couldn't sleep for days after, wondering if it was really just budget, wondering if it mattered that he wore his hair out in a twist-out that week. He looked up at Traoré with a strange mix of admiration and grief. On the far left aisle, Deborah Keyes sat motionless. She had flown in from Fort Wayne, Indiana. She worked as a community organizer and had seen enough politicians and activists in her life to stay skeptical. But there was something in the way this man wasn't trying to prove he knew America. He didn't fake cultural references. He wasn't quoting Tupac or MLK. He spoke of blackness as something spiritual, borderless, and that hit her deep. Deborah remembered a girl she once worked with. 17, bright, curious, kept a notebook of ideas for a youth center she wanted to build someday. She was killed in a crossfire walking home from a corner store. No headline, just a name on a chalkboard at a local vigil. When Traoré said, "You were made to think survival is shameful," Deborah felt it in her chest. She whispered, "It's not," to herself like a confirmation. Up in the balcony, a college professor named Ronald Keene adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. He'd studied African history for years, written papers, taught seminars. But listening to this speech, he realized how often he'd intellectualized the struggle. Traoré wasn't quoting Fanon or Du Bois. He was reaching people, not impressing them. And maybe that's why it worked. Because it wasn't theory, it was memory made real again. The audience, scattered and diverse, began to change. It wasn't that they all agreed on everything Traoré said, but they recognized themselves in his words. And sometimes that's harder to process than disagreement. An older man near the back wiped his eyes. A young girl in braids stopped drawing in her notebook. A middle-aged woman in a rust-colored jacket grabbed the hand of the man next to her and didn't let go. These weren't just listeners anymore. These were people seeing parts of their lives reflected back at them in a language that didn't need translation. But before anyone could stand to speak, Traoré walked back to the center of the stage and said something no one expected from a foreign head of state. Traoré stood at the center of the stage again, but this time he wasn't looking at the whole room. He was scanning it slowly, almost like he was searching for someone. He tilted his head slightly to the side and let out a quiet breath into the mic. "I didn't come to speak at you," he said. "I came to speak to you." And then his tone changed, softer, slower, but somehow even heavier. "I have walked through Ouagadougou during curfew. I've seen mothers who fed 5 children with 1 bowl of rice, and they still found the strength to sing. I've seen young men build radios from scraps just to hear a voice that reminded them they mattered." He took a step closer to the front. "And I've heard the silence here, not the quiet, the silence that eats into your bones when your story is erased. When the neighborhood you grew up in is replaced by coffee shops and no one remembers what was there before. When your high school friend gets 25 years for what another boy in Scottsdale gets probation." The crowd shifted, not out of discomfort, but something else. Recognition. He raised his voice just a touch, but not in anger. It sounded more like urgency. "They want you to think you are alone, that Africa doesn't care, that we are too far away to understand, that we are only poor, desperate, chaotic." He paused, looked left, then right. "That is a lie." A wave of quiet rippled through the hall. "In my village, elders speak of you. They say your names with reverence. They say, 'Our children were taken, but they are still ours.'" He let that line hang in the air. A man near the front dropped his head. His daughter reached over and gently touched his arm. No one said a word. You are not forgotten in Accra, not in Bamako, not in Cotonou. We do not see you as broken. We see you as exiled. A few murmurs now. One man near the aisle whispered, Lord have mercy. Someone behind him wiped her face. I have met farmers who sent their best yams to markets only to be told they weren't good enough for export. But still, they try again. Because that is what we do. We try again. And you, after all the years, all the theft, all the tricks, they still have not broken you. He glanced back at the crowd, his face quiet again. Don't think you are not seen. You are. And you are loved. You are not a forgotten branch. You are part of the root. Now someone clapped. Not fast, just once, then again. Then others joined in. A rhythm began to build, like waves hitting shore one after the other. People didn't rise to their feet, not yet, but you could feel the tension building in their legs. Like they wanted to, but needed permission. Or maybe they needed to know the moment was real. He nodded once, then spoke again, calm but clear. I say your names in our prayers, not because you are weak, but because you carry so much, more than anyone was ever meant to carry alone. And that was the moment. One woman stood, then a man in the back, then another, hands clapping, some lifted, a few tears openly wiped away now. Traoré didn't smile, he didn't take a bow, he just stepped back, let the energy rise, and waited. But he wasn't finished, because even as the room swelled with emotion, what he said next would draw the attention of someone watching backstage, someone who didn't want him there in the first place. Backstage, the energy was entirely different. While the crowd outside had begun to rise to its feet, stunned by Traoré's words, behind the velvet curtain near stage left, a quiet storm was brewing. A small group of organizers and VIP coordinators huddled in a narrow hallway, eyes locked on the monitor showing the live feed of the speech. Among them stood Martin Cleary, a liaison with the summit's national partners, and he didn't look pleased. This wasn't in the program, he muttered, arms folded, brows furrowed. Who cleared this? No one answered. Next to him, Olivia Bent, one of the cultural outreach leads, tapped rapidly on her phone. She wasn't texting, she was scrolling Twitter, and the numbers were climbing, fast. He's trending already, she said under her breath. They're clipping the speech and pushing it hard. The quotes, the tone, the footage, it's all over the place. Martin didn't even glance at her screen. I don't care if he's trending. We didn't vet this man. We don't know what he's going to say next. From further down the hall, someone added, we invited him because we needed international presence, not because we wanted a revolution on stage. But it was too late for that. On stage, the crowd was fully alive. They weren't just reacting, they were feeling it in their bodies, and the kind of moment organizers pray for, unless they don't control it. One man in a beige blazer leaned in. You think he's going to call for something dangerous? Martin shook his head. I think he already has. You just don't hear it yet. Inside the auditorium, Traoré stepped forward again. They ask me, what is my goal? My ambition? His voice was still even. They expect I will say prosperity or peace. But I say, my goal is for my people to live without chains. Chains on the mind, chains on the market, chains in the courtrooms. And that goal does not stop at any border. Backstage, Martin glanced sharply at Olivia. You hear that? She nodded. I hear it. Martin pulled out his phone and started texting. Not a tweet, not a photo, a message, to whom no one knew. At that moment, a security staffer wearing a summit badge quietly approached the side of the curtain and spoke into a mic clipped to his collar. Just confirming, the man whispered. Do we need to step in? A beat of silence, then a flat reply from someone on the other end. Not yet. Back in the crowd, Traoré kept going. You were sold centuries ago, but you are not for sale now, and if anyone tries to buy your silence, they are buying smoke. The applause started again, but it wasn't just polite, it was heated. like it came from the gut. But not everyone clapped. A few seats in the front row remained still. Invited officials, major donors, organizers who wore forced smiles and stiff posture. One man in a Navy suit leaned toward the woman next to him and whispered, "He's stepping way over the line." She replied without turning her head, "Whose line?" The two didn't speak again. From backstage, Martin watched the screen as Traoré paced slowly across the stage, speaking directly to young people now. You do not need their language to speak truth. You do not need their degree to think. You do not need their permission to be free. That was the sentence, the one that made Martin flinch. He stepped back and rubbed his face. This wasn't supposed to be a political statement, he muttered to himself. This was supposed to be cultural unity, mutual exchange, safe dialogue. Olivia cut him off. "It is unity," she said, barely containing her voice. "It just doesn't look like the version we've been comfortable with." He turned to her. "You realize this is going to get messy, right?" She stared at the screen for a few more seconds, watching Traoré lift his hand, not in salute, not in victory, but in solidarity. "Maybe it was already messy," she said, "and we've just been pretending it wasn't." But before Martin could respond, Traoré paused on stage and began the story that would quiet even the loudest applause. The clapping faded, the standing, the hands in the air, the murmurs of agreement, everything slowly settled back into place. The auditorium wasn't quiet because it was over. It was quiet because everyone sensed something else was coming. Traoré took a long breath and adjusted the mic. Then, without warning, he told a story. "There was a boy in a small town just outside of Bobo Dioulasso," he began, voice lower now, steadier. "His father was a mechanic. His mother sold mangoes on the roadside. They had no books at home. But the boy listened. He watched. He remembered everything. He wasn't reading from anything. He wasn't rushing. He was speaking the way someone tells you about a scar. One day, soldiers came through, foreign, smiling at first, then not smiling. They weren't there to protect. They were there to extract money, information, silence. The boy watched as his father was beaten for refusing to give up something that belonged to him, a crate of tools, his only source of income. No one moved. It was like the air in the room had grown heavy. The next morning, Traoré continued, the boy's mother wrapped his head in a cloth and told him, "We don't kneel for those who forget our names." He paused. "I was that boy." The room didn't react at first. It wasn't confusion. It was the kind of stillness that happens when everyone knows they're being handed something real, something you don't interrupt with noise. Traoré looked down, then back up. That beating, that injustice, it lit a fire in me, not hatred, conviction that we were not weak, that we were not what they said we were. And I know many of you have your own story like that, a moment that changed how you see the world, a wound that made you dangerous, not in violence, but in truth. He leaned back into the mic. You are dangerous when you know who you are. A voice from the back of the auditorium said loudly, "Say that again." Without missing a beat, Traoré repeated, "You are dangerous when you know who you are." And that's when it happened. An older woman, probably in her late 60s, stood up near the center aisle. She had a cane. She was wearing a long maroon coat with a Black Panther pin on the lapel. Slowly, deliberately, she began to clap. Not fast, just steady. 1, 2, 3, then more. One by one, people rose. Not because someone told them to, but because their bodies had to. The room erupted, not into frenzy, but a wave of energy that passed from row to row. There were tears, real ones. Some people held their chests like they had just heard the truth spoken aloud for the first time in years. A man in the back raised his fist. A woman near the stage whispered something to herself and held her hands to her lips. One teenage girl cried openly into her mother's shoulder. And Traoré didn't soak it in. He didn't say thank you. He just stood there, hands by his sides, letting the moment be the moment. Backstage, Olivia Bent had stopped watching her phone. She was just standing there, mouth slightly open, eyes locked on the screen. Martin didn't say a word. He just sat down on a folding chair slowly, his face pale. In the wings of the stage, one of the camera operators turned his rig off. Not out of protest, he just forgot to keep filming. People had heard speeches before. They'd heard anger and hope and lectures. But what Traoré did wasn't a performance. It wasn't charisma. It wasn't showmanship. It was truth carried without apology. And when he finally spoke again, it was only one sentence. Never ask the world for permission to remember who you are. That was it. There was no chant, no official ending. Just the kind of moment people would later say changed something, not because of policy or promise, but because someone finally said it. But while the crowd was rising to their feet, clapping and whispering to one another, the outside world was just beginning to notice. And not everyone welcomed what was coming next. The next morning, you couldn't scroll for 3 minutes without seeing his face. Clips of Ibrahim Traoré's speech had flooded the internet overnight. It wasn't a press team or PR campaign. It was people. Hundreds of cell phone recordings from every angle, some shaky, some grainy, some just captured his voice echoing through the auditorium, and they were all being shared with one caption: "You need to hear this." In Oakland, a young college student named Chloe Boyd had posted a 47-second clip to her Instagram story around midnight. She had barely captioned it, just added, "This man just changed how I see myself." By the time she woke up, it had been reposted over 4,000 times. Further south in Long Beach, a poet named Reggie Tillman stayed up until 3 a.m. writing a new piece. Inspired by Traoré's line, "You are dangerous when you know who you are," he scribbled verses onto napkins and receipts. By sunrise, he had already uploaded the poem in a black and white video. It hit 50,000 views before noon. But it wasn't just students and artists who reacted. That morning, a panel on a popular cable news show tried to spin it as anti-American rhetoric from an uninvited foreign official. One host used words like reckless and provocative. Another warned about foreign influence on domestic narratives. And still, the clips kept spreading. Some major outlets didn't know what to make of it. Traoré wasn't a household name in the States. He didn't have a book deal or a documentary. He didn't speak with polished campaign language. He spoke like he didn't need the system at all. That made some people uncomfortable, but it made others awake. In Baltimore, an older man named Curtis Wynn, who ran a small barbershop, played the speech on loop all day. Customers sat down in the chair and didn't say much at first, just listened. One man whispered, "He's talking like my uncle used to talk," before they stopped putting him on panels. In Seattle, a high school teacher named Ray Geneva printed out key quotes from the speech and taped them along the hallway wall of her classroom. Don't ask them for keys. You are not a forgotten branch. You are part of the root. Never ask the world for permission to remember who you are. Students stopped and read them. Some asked where the quotes came from. She didn't give them a full lecture, just told them to look him up, to listen. By noon, major figures were chiming in. A former NBA star reposted a clip with the caption, "We've waited decades for a voice like this." A singer known for her activism uploaded an old photo of herself in Burkina Faso, writing, "This brother speaks the truth." But not all the attention was kind. Some conservative commentators said the speech was dangerous, fueling division, stirring unrest. Others questioned his background. Old articles about Burkina Faso's political instability began circulating again. Traoré was accused of being too radical, too vague, too bold. Still, the comments kept pouring in. Under one clip, someone had written, "I listened to him while sitting in my car after work. Didn't even realize I was crying till it was over." Another read, "My son asked me what he meant by carrying wounds that make you dangerous. We sat in the kitchen and talked for an hour." The wave didn't feel like a trend. It felt like something people had been waiting for without knowing it. A reminder that history wasn't just books and documentaries. It was personal. It was still happening. By evening, someone had organized an online event. a live stream forum to talk about the speech. No fancy graphics, just people in Zoom boxes sharing what it meant to them. The link spread like wildfire. It filled up in less than 10 minutes. Meanwhile, Traoré had already left the hotel. No press conference, no interviews, just gone. He wasn't chasing the moment. He had delivered the message and moved on. The impact would do the rest. But while his name lit up every platform, inside the homes of those who'd heard him live, something more personal was happening. Quiet, unseen, and just as powerful. That night, far from the trending hashtags and YouTube uploads, the weight of Traoré's words settled into homes like dust after a long storm. Marcia Darnell sat alone in her kitchen in Baton Rouge. She hadn't spoken much on the plane ride home. Her granddaughter had tried to talk about the speech, but Marcia had just smiled gently and said, "Give me a day." Now she was home, shoes off, tea steaming in front of her. The house was quiet. She stared at an old photo on the wall. Her father in a pressed white shirt standing in front of a corner store long since demolished. She remembered the way he used to pause before speaking, like his words had to push through something heavy to come out. Marcia reached for a notepad and began to write. Not a response, not a speech, just thoughts, things she hadn't said aloud in years. We knew we were somebody before they told us we weren't. Why did we stop telling each other? She didn't plan to publish it, but she kept writing. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, Deborah Keyes was sitting in her small office, the door shut, the lights off except for the desk lamp. She was listening to the full audio of the speech again, not the viral clips, the whole thing, word for word. Every so often she paused and scribbled a note, a quote, a reaction. Her fingers trembled slightly. She wasn't afraid. She was remembering. She pulled out her old binder from the bottom shelf. Inside were notes from community meetings she led in the 90s, back when they were trying to stop liquor licenses from flooding black neighborhoods, back when they organized late-night food drops for single mothers. She flipped through the pages, slowly. We were building without being seen, she thought, and we forgot we didn't need permission to start again. She closed the binder and sat back. Across the country in Long Beach, Isaiah Benson was still wide awake. The apartment was dark except for the blue light of his TV screen. He had opened a blank document hours ago but hadn't typed anything yet. He wasn't a writer, not really. But something about Traoré's words had pressed a button in him. Not the anger, not the grief, the clarity. He picked up his phone and texted his mom. Me. What's the name of Granddad's hometown again? The one in Louisiana? Her. Shreveport. Why? Me. I think I want to go there. No response right away. But that was okay. Isaiah closed the document. He'd try again tomorrow. Elsewhere in cities big and small, the speech was still echoing. In church basements, in dorm rooms, on long car rides, in laundromats and night shifts. It wasn't the kind of message you could quote and move on from. It stayed in the gut. In one home in Tulsa, a woman named Gina had gathered her 2 teenage sons after dinner. She played the part of the speech where Traoré said, "You are not a forgotten branch." Her voice cracked halfway through reading it. Her sons sat quietly, unsure of what to say, but fully aware that something important was happening. Later, as she tucked them in, one of them asked, "Do they really talk about us in Africa?" She smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was heartbreaking that he even had to ask. "Yes, baby," she said. "They always have." And in a modest apartment in Memphis, a young man named Russell, who had once given up on finishing school, replayed a clip on his phone over and over again. The part where Traoré said, "Don't ask the same people who locked your doors to hand you the keys." Russell sat up straight, stared at his small desk, and finally opened the enrollment form he had downloaded months ago but never filled out. He started typing. But while individuals were quietly changing course in their own lives, the final message of Traoré's speech was still echoing, and it carried a lesson meant for more than just a moment. By the end of that week, Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just a foreign leader who gave a moving speech. He had become something else. Not a celebrity, not a viral moment, but a mirror, a reminder, a disruption. Not everyone agreed with him. Not everyone even understood him. But that didn't seem to matter. The message had already done its work. In the days that followed, you could feel it, if you were paying attention. A youth center in Montgomery, Alabama added a new wall mural with the words, "You are not a forgotten branch." In Milwaukee, a group of elders gathered for their usual dominoes game at a local rec center. But this time, they opened the afternoon with a recording of the speech and talked for over an hour before even touching the tiles. In New Haven, a small group of college students formed a book circle, not to study theory, but to trace their family roots. Some had never even asked about their lineage before. Now they were texting relatives, digging through birth certificates, reconnecting names and cities and pieces that had been silent for too long. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about politics. It was about the moment someone reminded them that their story didn't begin with struggle and certainly didn't have to end with survival. Traoré's words had reached beyond applause. He had spoken to the part of people that ached to be remembered. And that memory, that quiet, deep memory, was now working its way into places no headline could reach. But the lesson wasn't just in what he said, it was in how he said it. He hadn't come with answers. He hadn't come to perform. He came with truth, a truth carried not in shouting, not in slogans, but in stillness, in pauses, in the kind of clarity that only comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when the world keeps trying to tell you otherwise. That's what people couldn't stop talking about. A barber in Charleston said it best as he cut a customer's hair and kept the speech playing on loop from his phone. You know what hit me? He wasn't trying to be loved. He was trying to tell the truth. That's why it stuck. And maybe that's the point. We live in a world where people talk endlessly. They campaign, they market, they brand. But every once in a while, someone speaks without a script, without an agenda, and people recognize the difference. What Traoré did in that auditorium wasn't just historical, it was deeply personal. For every person who ever wondered if their story still mattered, for every voice that had gone quiet, for every family that forgot their origin, wasn't shame, it was power. The speech ended in less than an hour, but the impact, that was just beginning. And for those who were there, or who watched from across the country, or who heard it secondhand at the kitchen table from someone they loved, it wasn't just a good speech. It was a turning point. Not for the world, maybe, but for someone. And sometimes that's how change begins. In a barbershop, in a school hallway, in the quiet of your living room, where your child asks, "Do they know us?" And you finally answer, "Yes, they do, and we know ourselves too." So if you're still listening, remember what he said. You don't need permission to know who you are. You don't need applause to live in your truth. And you are not forgotten, not by your ancestors, not by history, and not by those still fighting across oceans for the same dignity. It's not about one man. It never was. It's about the flame his words lit. What you do with that part's on you. If this story made you reflect, feel, or remember something deep within yourself, share it, talk about it, hold on to it, and subscribe for more stories that speak not just to our present, but to where we've always belonged.